Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the interview between Joe Rogan and Alex Jones, featured on the Joe Rogan Experience in October of 2020. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll summarize the discussion, and then I'll provide my analysis. In this interview, there was a third person, some type of comedian. I didn't factor him into the summary or the analysis. Toward the beginning of the interview, we see that Rogan talks about how censorship is a slippery slope. This is a point he makes several times in several ways throughout the over 3-hour interview. Essentially, Rogan says that censorship invariably goes too far, and it ultimately encourages conspiracy theorists to have doubts about the government, the media, big tech, and all that. So it's used to confirm their beliefs. In this interview with Jones, it's clear that Rogan wants to hold Jones somewhat accountable, although Rogan's fact-checking skills seem to be limited to simply checking to see if a document or a website that Jones referred to actually exists, then reading a small part of it. Learning fact-checking from Joe Rogan is like learning table manners from the Cookie Monster. The simple existence of a document doesn't mean that the content of the document supports whatever conclusion Jones had. It's just one piece of a much larger picture. So really we see that Rogan is taking things out of context in a way just like Jones does. This would be like if Alex Jones claimed that he built the Eiffel Tower, with his proof being that the Eiffel Tower actually existed. So Rogan would look at a picture of the Eiffel Tower and say, I had my doubts, but no one can deny it exists. Therefore, you must have built it. Rogan gives this advice to Alex Jones. You need a legitimate journalist to help you slow down and stop. Rogan also repeats a familiar message when he said that Jones gets so much right, and it's a shame that he gets dismissed because of the times that he is wrong. From the beginning, it seemed like the temperament of Jones was quite a bit different than what I've seen in his other appearances. He was still obnoxious and over the top, but less unrefined. He was being somewhat cautious as compared to his usual behavior. After discussing Ghislaine Maxwell and Hunter Biden, we see that Jones said, I'm not trying to make stuff up. Later, he would say that he was not trying to rant. In both cases, I was thinking, you don't have to try. It seems to come automatically for you. Next, we see how they touch on how the press didn't really cover the peace deals that Trump had negotiated. Throughout the interview, we see similar complaints. They talk about how the media is biased to the left. Jones goes on this whole discussion about carbon dioxide, the carbon conspiracy, and suggests that global warming is good, saying that people need it. He mentions the centralized world government conspiracy. I would have been really surprised if he did not mention that during this interview. It's really the unifying belief of conspiracy theorists. At some level, most conspiracy theories point back to this idea that there will be one government that controls the entire world. So these evil operators want to pull this government together and make it a reality. After talking about electric cars and referring to Deepwater Horizon as Event Horizon, which is an understandable mistake, we see that Jones starts talking about the post-human era. The problem with this term is that there's really no single definition for it. The definition that Jones seems to be using is this idea that people will integrate technology and become cyborgs, losing what makes them human. And of course, the government causes all this. Jones then goes on to talk about other topics like Nexium, the CIA, FBI devil worshippers, how Epstein was just a player in a larger conspiracy, how the evil conspirators are projecting their hatred. I thought this was interesting. Here we see that Jones offers a look inside the mind of one of the elite evildoers, again saying their motivation is hatred. This is a departure from the traditional motivation that is assigned to them, which is power. Jones talked about his theories on COVID, suggesting that deaths are overreported. It's part of a larger conspiracy. Bill Gates is not qualified to offer advice on the subject. And Jones said that vitamins could help treat COVID. He mentions that, conveniently, he happens to sell vitamins. Jones continues with popular topics in the area of conspiracy. the Whitmer plot, the Rockefellers, and his anti-vaccination position. Then we see this tangent where both Rogan and Jones speculate on the nature of the universe, sticking with the Sesame Street theme I used before, like with the Cookie Monster, which seems fitting for this interview. This was like Bert and Ernie trying to disarm a bomb. It may be fun to watch, but you don't want to stand too close. At the end of the interview, there's a twist. Jones talks about how he wants to retire in a year. He works 18 hours a day. He claims he reads 50 articles a day. If it took him 20 minutes to read one article, that would be 1,000 minutes of reading a day, or over 16 and a half hours. That's a little hard to believe. Even if he could somehow read an article in 10 minutes, that would still be over 8 hours of reading in addition to his other activities. For those that may be disappointed by the idea that Jones is retiring, there's really nothing to worry about. He said he was going to clean up his mistakes, so that'll take around 30 years or so. I'm not sure what Jones is trying to achieve with his threat of retirement. Perhaps he is desperate for attention. Rogan broached the topic of Adderall toward the end of the interview. Jones wouldn't talk about that. Jones consumed about a half a bottle of what appeared to be whiskey over the course of the interview. We know that in March of 2020, Jones was arrested for DUI. Rogan leaves Jones with some advice about getting a personal trainer, eating right, and exercising. Rogan was really pushing this quite a bit toward the end of the interview. So what are the key takeaways from this interview? Here we see that Rogan really didn't challenge Jones effectively. This is something that's fairly common throughout Rogan's podcasts. I think he did a better job of looking like he was trying to challenge Jones, but again, Rogan doesn't really seem to know what fact-checking is. One of the disadvantages of interviews this long, again over 3 hours long, is having to hear Jones talk that much. He's loud and has a high rate of speech already, so multiplying that times 3 hours is really an awful listening experience. One of the advantages, however, was getting to see the pattern in his behavior. It's a good way to understand his style because we see the same behavior repeat several times over the course of the interview. An attorney for Jones once said that Jones was a performance artist, which is supported by what we see in this interview. The strategy of Jones is fairly straightforward. He reads a lot of material on politics, big tech, social trends, historical figures, and other materials related to conspiracy theories. Jones has a phenomenal memory, so he can recall how various occurrences, statements, or theories may be connected in some way to a current topic of discussion. He decides what the outcome, meaning, or consequence of the current topic really is, and this outcome may or may not be true. Then he connects these different items in his memory to that alleged outcome, noting that it just can't be a coincidence. There must be a grand conspiracy that explains the connection. After he makes all these connections, he switches to another alleged outcome and does the same thing. In this interview, he simply overwhelmed Rogan by running through this cycle many times. In addition, Jones makes a lot of predictions. Almost all of them are incorrect, but once in a while, he makes a correct prediction. He emphasizes the very few that are correct and conveniently forgets about all the ones that were incorrect. One of the reasons that Jones is so effective is that many people who like him have a strong incentive to believe that their paranoia is justified. They need to believe that a small evil group is trying to run the world. Also, they don't seem to understand the difference between correlation and causation. For example, we know that drowning deaths are positively correlated with ice cream sales. If Jones looked at this fact, he might come up with this idea that ice cream causes drownings. And then, of course, he would throw in something about evil operators in the government. He would discount the possibility that warm summer weather actually causes both. More people swimming means an increased probability of drowning, and people tend to buy more ice cream in the summer. People who defend him say that the connections he makes are possible, but they forget about the other highly probable explanations. The irony of Alex Jones, exemplified in this interview, is that his behavior reduces the probability that an actual conspiracy could be uncovered. It's like if Jones were in a hotel and repeatedly pulled the fire alarm. When there was really a fire, nobody would leave. Alex Jones is like a comedian whose style is out of date and inappropriate. The only difference is that at one time, most comedians were funny. So stepping back and looking at perhaps the larger issue here, Rogan defends having Jones on his show by saying that this is free speech, an argument that many people connect with. They look at the nonsensical claims of Alex Jones and say, okay, no reasonable person would believe him, but giving him a platform is important to protecting free speech. I can appreciate this argument, but I think the key word here is really speech. Is simply talking the same thing as speech as used in the phrase freedom of speech? Giving Jones a platform is a lot like if a bus rider decided they would publish their own bus schedule with incorrect times to match their watch, which has the wrong time. Should that bus schedule be made available to everyone who rides the bus? What is the utility in having misinformation? Is misinformation actually important? I think Rogan can make a better argument that Jones is simply entertaining to have on a show. But to make this argument that Jones is important to society is like confusing noise for a symphony. So those are my thoughts on Rogan's interview of Jones. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. Thanks for watching.